Hello fellow survivors, and welcome back once again. I hope you guys are all ready for this one, as I feel like this guide is going to be the one that bridges and ties all the other guides together into a cohesive whole. So while all those other guides I've produced so far are good and deliver tips on topic for their segment and can be viewed alone, the real power of them lies in their collective knowledge put to greater use. I of course hinted at that a bit in my making progress video, but in this guide we're going to break it down step by step so you understand exactly how to put all this information to good use. If you played the Long Dark, wow I can talk huh? If you played the Long Dark for anything longer than 10 hours or have at least 2 runs or attempts made, you'll probably begin to appreciate the concept of stages or sections in the game. As with any game, the Long Dark drives you forward with tension and needs, and it's up to you to fulfill those needs or die. As of the making of this video, there's 2 major distinctions or sections in the Long Dark: the early game and the mid game. As it currently stands, there's no real compelling late game that arrives to challenge you one final time. If sandbox mode ever changes to a point where there could conceivably be an end game, you'll find a card in the upper right hand corner linking to a video on that subject. As of now, or the making of this video, that's not the case. So the concept of the early and mid game should be familiar if you've seen my making progress video. Basically, the Long Dark's characterized by a difficulty curve where you have 2 major identifiable points on it, and we're going to focus in this video on the early game first. And it's pretty easy to identify the early game. First off, as you could have probably guessed by its name, it's the first part of any run or game. It's characterized by you starting off with no loot, minimal gear, and left to nature's whims and fancies to bout you about as she pleases. That's the initial struggle between survivor and nature, and who comes out on top will be defined by how well you know yourself and the world in the Long Dark. And I am a terrible speaker, but that's okay, I can still give you guys information. So regardless of whether you have some objectives and goals for whatever specific run you're playing or not, now's the time to start. You're going to need to start with that plan, and you're going to need a very simple plan to begin with, which can have a lot of variance to it depending on what difficulty you're playing at. Obviously, Pilgrim players will have lots of leeway and second chances with their decisions, whereas you hardcore Loper players, you're going to feel the squeeze of every mistake. And I will do a breakdown in the future of tuning your goals and plans based on whatever difficulty you're playing at, but of course you cannot niche down until you have the basics down pat. So the first question you have to ask yourself is, where am I and how do I get the stuff? And if you have no prior map knowledge, or this is your first run of the game, I'd highly recommend you go and watch both my beginner's guide video and making progress video. And then come back to watch this as soon as you have, as those will help a ton with this. If you don't watch any of my other guides, I really suggest you watch those 2. And you'll find a card for them in the upper right. Once you've identified where you are, or at least have a decent idea where you are, it's time to head out to the nearest location of safety and loot it. And of course your goals are simple: try and stay warm, find some food and clothes, and survive the first day. You shouldn't attempt to trek across 3 regions or expect to find all the tools and gear on your first day, but you should focus on the basics. And follow this idea of basics for the first few days. You're not trying to go Django Unchained up in this wintry joint, just settle into a rhythm. Settle into that rhythm of getting the basics every day. And your goal by doing that and following this rhythm should be very simple. Just get to a point where you have enough food and water for 2 or more days, and your clothes are good enough to brave the cold for at least a few hours before you can begin to freeze. Beyond that, you can tune based on your objectives. Suppose you're going for crafted clothing. Now is going to be the time to start hunting and get your hands on a bow or rifle and collect those hides you're going to need and get them curing inside. Or maybe you're planning on a crafting run at a forge. Now's the time to kit up with that hammer and hacksaw and collect all the fuel. No matter how you choose to focus, the idea is the same: to exit the early game. And how do you know when you've done that? It's kind of simple. Once you have the tools and weapons on you, you can forge out into the wilderness with some ease to collect what you don't have, and you can supply yourself with food above and beyond what you find lying about in abandoned homes. That's when you've begun to leave the early game and have entered the mid game. The early game is all about collecting the supplies you'll need to become self-sufficient. You cannot survive completely, nor forever, off of the manufactured and found goods of the Long Dark. As I've said before, this statement carries different weight depending on your difficulty. Pilgrim players can expect to find a lot of time to explore and collect due to calmer weather and absolutely no hostile wildlife, unless of course you're trying to pique their interest. Whereas an interloper player is going to be fighting tooth and nail for every scrap of cloth and every calorie of food. I'll say it again, the early game is specifically characterized by not having what you need and being forced into uncomfortable situations, into the blizzards, into a pack of wolves to collect it. This is where a lot of players, especially new players, struggle with for a long time. And I'll expound to put this into perspective before we go on solving your problem. The reason a lot of players struggle is compound and complex, or multifaceted, and I cannot assist every player with every facet of those challenges. But where I can help is arming you guys with the knowledge you need to put things into perspective and begin to get a handle on the world. And that's where planning comes in. Without it, you're like a ship without a rudder, you're just being shoved about by the forces that be. So bust out that long-term goal setter of yours and get an idea of what you want to accomplish and then begin executing. Have multiple goals for each day in sort of a ranked order. You want to go out looking for more supplies but it's a blizzard? Focus on researching or fixing what gear you do have till the weather's better. Blocked off where you want to go by hostile wildlife and no weapons to contest that? Either find a different route or choose a separate objective. This is where decision making and planning come in. I'll give you guys an example to make sense of all of it into kind of a bit of a whole so it makes sense. I've been playing Interloper a lot lately, and you guys have probably seen my playthroughs on that. If you haven't, go ahead. But Interloper offers you no manufactured tools like a knife or a hatchet besides a hacksaw and hammer. And you need a knife and a hatchet, or at least one of them, to craft anything in the game. So you're going to have to forge all of those. This is part of leaving the early game and entering the mid game. So there's a stronger barrier in Interloper than the other difficulties. So a priority goal of yours is to find the hammer, collect some scrap metal, and haul butt to the nearest forge and make yourself a knife and perhaps a hatchet or arrowheads in addition to that knife. The point is, without those tools, you'll never become self-sufficient and will be at the mercy of the weather and the wildlife, and you'll only last so long that way. The solution is to get those tools so you can craft other things like clothing and the bow to defend yourself. This is where that long-term plan comes into play. You have to know what's going to affect you and how it's going to affect you in order to set yourself up for success. That's where a long-term plan comes into play. You have to have those objectives at the forefront of your mind in order to progress. You have to push towards them. So while you super new players won't have all the knowledge about what you can do and what's available to you, you can start to plan ahead in your first few runs by making sure you have a set of simple goals in mind and pushing towards them. This will set you up for success because as you play, you'll gain these knowledges of the world, its bounty, what's available to you, what's not, where you can get things, and you'll be able to leverage that in your favor. The most knowledge you'll gain is by actually playing. I can give you guys pointers and tips out the wazoo to assist you guys in mastering the world of the long dart, but ultimately it's going to all be head knowledge until you make it practical by diving in and giving it your best shot. And I will preface it by this: I am the worst at following my own advice. I'm terrible at it. So I oftentimes make easy mistakes that could have otherwise been avoidable and put myself in a bad position. And that's because it's head knowledge. I've not implemented it. I know it, but I'm not doing it. And that's something we all have to get over and start implementing in order to succeed in the long dart. So I'll summarize once more. Plan ahead so you can make progress by pushing towards those goals. Here's another example. Problem: you need food. Solution: hunt for food. So here's where your plan comes into place. You'll take your rifle that you just found, you're going to head out to that clearing where you saw deer while you were on your way to shelter, and hopefully you'll be able to bag one for yourself. Then, weather depending, you'll be able to decide whether to gut him on the spot and begin cooking up all that meat, or else you can quarter him and take a bag home with you so you can cook on the stove inside where the wind isn't going to blow it out. That's a short-term plan to fulfill one goal for the day. Expand that out to everything you need to push yourself to self-sustenance and then start pursuing a plan for that. I need clothes, tools, firewood, etc. Plan excursions to collect those materials and save the crafting for bum days when you can't be outside due to the weather. So that's where the long-term plan comes into effect. You begin to prioritize. So again, for example, in Interloper, the first goal you have to achieve is getting tools. So you have to do a forge run. Then the second stage is getting your crafted clothing, because otherwise you'll never be able to be self-sustainable, because you will freeze the first 5 minutes after walking out the front door. So then you got to get clothing as well. Then after clothing, you've got to start moving towards sustainable food sources, so you're not constantly overhunting a particular area and running out of food and thinking, oh no, what am I gonna do? And so that's where the long-term plan comes into play. And this is where having playing the game is where that knowledge comes in. That's where you begin to learn, especially based off of whatever difficulty you're playing, what kind of threats will make themselves known to you, what kind of challenges you have to overcome, and what steps you need to take to overcome those challenges. And that's where the plan comes into play. I hope this has all made sense. I've tried to summarize it, and I've tried to give you guys some examples so it makes sense, so you guys can understand it and then begin to implement it. As always, I've been Lonelywolf. I hope this guide has given you guys some insight as to how you can tie all of this information from the previous guides together and help you begin your journey to success and self-sustainability in the long dark. If you've enjoyed and actually stuck around long enough to finish, please consider subscribing to catch more of my great content. It would really help. Thank you! And until next time, stay safe and stay warm out there.